so we'll move forward into Ezekiel chapter 41. It says, "Afterward he brought me to the temple and measured the posts, 6 cubits broad on the one side and 6 cubits broad on the other side, which was the breadth of the tabernacle." And so when we're discussing the temple, we're going to discuss this building right here. This entire area is the temple complex, but the temple itself is in this inner area right here. You have to enter in through these gates and then through these gates, and you reach this little courtyard here, and then finally you reach the actual temple itself. And I did obtain a few more images that I thought might be helpful as far as the understanding of the way that this is constructed here. Before we get into that, I do have a couple of one extra image from something we studied last week in chapter 40 about the windows of narrowing frames. And so if you were to look at the gates, the gate towers, which are these constructions here, there's 3 on the outer wall, south, east, and north, and then there's 3 on this inner wall for the courtyard, north, east, south. That's what this image is here. It's a rendition of what that would look like. And so it talks about windows of narrowing frames in chapter 40. And I didn't really describe much or have a good image for what those windows would look like, but that's an idea of what they would look like. They'd be these narrow slats where light would come through. So then we see, this is how chapter 40 ended. We ended chapter 40 by coming up to the doors of the temple, and that's what we're looking at here in chapter 41, about being brought to the temple and there being posts. And so whenever we're here, we're looking right at the doors to the entryway of the temple itself. And so there are pillars there, and I mentioned last week I wasn't going to use too many fancy images. I still think these are pretty basic. They do put a little bit of gold overlay on some things, but just keep in mind that this is merely just a 3D rendition. This is not the actual, for sure, what it's going to look like. I don't even want to give you the idea that this is that the colors are going to match, but as far as the shape and the dimensions, that's what the key is, and that's really what we're seeing here when we're reading through these chapters. We're getting the dimensions and the overall shape and appearance of the building itself, not necessarily the decorations. There is a little bit of mention of decorations, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to just kind of focus on the actual structure. And so it says, the pillars. It says the pillars are 6 cubits broad on one side and 6 cubits broad on the other, and so that's what this is here. It's 6 cubits inward and 6 cubits inward in order to get to the door. So you'll go through this walkway here. The width is 10 cubits, and then the sides of each of these are 5 cubits. So there's these very massive pillars that are you walk through. Now here we get into, so we've gone past what is in verse 2. It says, "And the breadth of the door was 10 cubits, and the sides of the door are 5 cubits on the one side and 5 cubits on the other side. And he measured the length thereof 40 cubits, the breadth 20 cubits. Then went he inward." And so this is what this is the room when you go inside the door. That's the room. And it says, "And measured the post of the door 2 cubits, and the door 6 cubits, and the breadth of the door 7 cubits." So he measured the length thereof 20 cubits, and the breadth 20 cubits before the temple, and he said to me, "This is the most holy place." And so we see this is the most holy place, and it's behind, when you walk in, it's behind this altar here, and there's another walkway in here, and you can see there's no veil. The veil is not returned to the temple. There is no separation there between the holy and the most holy in the way that it was before. Now that doesn't mean that every single person on earth is just going to be able to, anytime they want to, walk into the most holy place. I don't think that's how it works. But what we see here is the veil that was torn when Jesus was crucified is not part of this construction. You don't see the veil mentioned anywhere in these chapters. And so that veil was a symbol, a representation of the separation between humanity and God. It was a representation that our sins prevent us from being able to reach and contact God. Jesus corrected all that. At his death, the veil was torn, it was ripped in half, and it was never returned. His blood became the offering that redeemed us of our sins. Not merely covered our sins for a time, but they redeemed us from our sins. And so we have access to God because of what Jesus did for us. And so this is the most holy. And I know you probably see these patterns here that are on the walls. We'll discuss those in a second. But that's what it says here. You see the side pillar of entrance is 2 cubits. You see the entrance itself is 6 cubits. And then the width around the entrance is 7 cubits. I'm assuming, just for my own personal purposes, that the cubit here is not the standard 18-inch cubit that most people think about, but that it's most likely a 7-hand measure cubit, which would be about 24, 25, 26 inches. So just assuming about 2 feet, you're looking at 14 feet here, 14 feet here, 12 feet here. So that's about 40 feet across here. Now, the people who made these images, I think they're actually assuming an 18-inch cubit. Doesn't matter. Everything's still proportional with one another. So my version is just going to be a little bit bigger than theirs, but it's going to be the same. Everything's going to relate to everything else in the same way. And so now we see in verse 6, it says, "And the side chambers were 3," or in verse 5, it says, "And he measured the wall of the house 6 cubits, and the breadth of every side chamber 4 cubits, round about the house on every side." And then verse 6 says, "And the side chambers were 3, one over another, and 30 in order. And they entered into the wall which was of the house for the side chambers round about, that they might have hold, but they had not hold in the wall of the house." And so that's what you see. You see the 6 cubits here, the wall, and you see side chambers here. And if you count, there's 1, 2, it goes all the way around. There's 30 of these chambers here, and there's 3 stories of them. So they go up in 3 layers. And it says, "They had not hold in the wall of the house." It says, "And there was an enlarging and a winding about still upward to the side chambers, for the winding about of the house went still upward round about the house. Therefore the breadth of the house was still upward, and so increased from the lowest chamber to the highest by the midst." And so they say a winding. And so this person who made this image is assuming this sort of winding staircase right here that goes and lets out on each level, so you can reach each of these chambers. Now, to me, maybe it's talking about a winding staircase. Maybe there's some solid winding structure, more like a winding ramp. I don't know. Staircase seems just as good and sensical to me as anything else. So again, this isn't a 100%. This is what it'll be, but this is just an understanding of how it might look based upon the descriptions that we have. So now we'll go to the next verse. In verse 8 it says, "I saw also the height of the house round about, the foundations of the side chambers were a full reed of 6 great cubits." And so we see the foundation here. And it says, "The thickness of the wall which was for the side chamber without was 5 cubits, and that which was left was the place of the side chambers that were within." And so this these chambers here, this is kind of what you see without the wall. But this is with the wall put back on. So that gives you an idea of what it would look like inside. And then that's the wall right here. And it says, in verse 10, and between the chambers was the wideness of 20 cubits round about the house on every side. And so it says, and the doors of the side chambers were toward the place that was left, one door toward the north, and another door toward the south, and the breadth of the place that was left was 5 cubits round about. And so that it's 5 cubits. This foundation is 6 cubits high, and then 5 cubits of space here from the edge of the foundation inward. And we see in verse 12, now the building that was before the separate place at the end toward the west was 70 cubits broad, and the wall of the building was 5 cubits thick round about, and the length thereof 90 cubits. And so this is the temple that we were discussing. That's the chambers here with their windows. And then there's a separated area that we read here in verse 12, and there's a separate place. And then if we go back to our image that we were using last week, you can see that that separate area is back behind the temple here. And it says in verse 12 that it's 70 cubits broad, and the wall of the building was 5 cubits thick round about, and the length thereof 90 cubits. And so it's a very large structure here. So I'm assuming about 180 feet wide here, and then about 140 feet or long, and then 140 feet wide or deep. And then it's got a very thick wall that's about 10 feet thick all the way around. In verse 13, so he measured the house 100 cubits long, and the separate place and the building with the walls thereof 100 cubits long. And so everything, all these together added up, is 100 cubits from the edge of the house here, the temple, all the way to the back wall of the separate area. It says that it's about 100 cubits in that direction. So that's about 200 feet, if my understanding is correct. Then we move on to verse 14. It says, also the breadth of the face of the house and of the separate place toward the east, and 100 cubits. And so again, you see 100 cubits this way and 100 cubits that way, which when we look here, there's a square that forms here. And so we have verse 16, and we're going to move on to doorposts here. It says, the doorposts and the narrow windows and the galleries round about on their 3 stories over against the door, sealed with wood round about, and from the ground up to the windows, and the windows were covered. And so that's what we saw back here. You see these windows here. There's windows for each of these chambers, and they're sealed with wood. It doesn't say which type of wood here. I'm going to assume that it's a luxury wood. I'm going to assume that it's not something like pine. I'm going to assume that it's something more like a very strong oak or a strong cedar or mahogany. I would assume cedar if I had to assume anything. But it's going to be something that's going to look very appealing and very nice. Again, this is just a very plain, basic image that we're getting, where everything's just an eggshell off-white. But in reality, this is going to be a very colorful and vibrant and beautiful place, with a lot of different accents and a lot of different decorations. Now it says in verse 17, to that above the door, even unto the inner house and without, and by all the wall round about, within and without, by measure, and it was made with cherubims and palm trees, so that a palm tree was between a cherub, and every cherub had two faces, so that the face of a man was toward the palm tree on the one side, and the face of a young lion toward the palm tree on the other side, and it was made through all the house round about. And so that's what we will go back here, and you can see cherub, palm tree, it's a pattern, and you can see it in here, and you can see it in here. This might be the best one. You got a palm tree here, a cherub here, a palm tree here, a cherub, palm tree, and then a palm tree, cherub, palm tree. And so this is the way that it's decorated. Now you might wonder, well, why does it have palm trees and cherubs inside? What's that supposed to mean? What's that supposed to signify? Is there any symbolism or meaning to it? I don't want to get too deep into that because I just don't know all the details. But what I do know is that when we go back to 1 Kings and we look at 1 Kings chapter 6 and chapter 7, we will see in verse 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 29 says, and he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers within and without. And the floor of the house he overlaid with gold within and without. And for the entering of the oracle he made doors of olive tree. The lintel and side posts were a fifth part of the wall. The two doors also were of olive tree, and he carved upon them carvings of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, and spread gold upon the cherubims and upon the palm trees. And so then we can go into 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 35, and it says, and in the top of the base was there a round compass of half a cubit high, and on the top of the base the ledges thereof and the borders thereof were the same. For on the plates of the ledges thereof and on the borders thereof he graved cherubims, lions, and palm trees according to the proportion of every one, and additions round about them. So these same decorations were used in the very first original temple that Solomon constructed. So that is as deep as I'll go as to why they're there. They were there the first time around. The similar images are going to be there the second time around. Now, we don't see individual descriptions of images of lions, but what we do see when we see the cherubim described, they've each got two faces. One is a face of a man facing toward a palm tree. One is the face of a lion facing the other direction toward a palm tree. The same kind of decorations are being included in the Millennial Temple that are being included in that were originally included in Solomon's Temple. Now again, this is just a very basic rendering, a very basic rendition. I don't know if that's what the palm trees will look like, and I highly doubt that's exactly what the cherubims will look like. But these are more or less just placeholders so you can see the pattern of how it works out. So we'll take our pictures back forward and get to where we were at earlier. Back to Ezekiel chapter 41. Ezekiel chapter 41, and we will be picking back up in verse 21. It says, the posts of the temple were squared, and the face of the sanctuary, the appearance of the one as the appearance of the other. The altar of wood was 3 cubits high, and the length thereof 2 cubits, and the corners thereof, and the length thereof, and the walls thereof were of wood. And he said unto me, this is the table that is before the Lord. That is the altar. And so in verse 23 it says, "And the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors." And so you see 1 door, 2 doors. They're together there. "And the doors had 2 leaves apiece, 2 turning leaves, 2 leaves for the one door, and 2 leaves for the other door. And there were made on them and on the doors of the temple cherubims and palm trees, like as were made upon the walls, and there were thick planks upon the face of the porch without, and there were narrow windows and palm trees on the one side and on the other side, and the sides of the porch and upon the side chambers of the house, and thick planks." And so it says there are 2 leaves, and so I don't know how well you can see it or how bright it looks to you, but these doors, they fold in on one another because they have leaves, and so they just fold in and you can go in. Again, there's no veil, there's no permanent separation here that symbolizes the separation that existed before. It's just a doorway that easily, 2 leaves, folds and is moved out of the way whenever entering into the most holy place. I can say that based on again, there's no veil, but in order for it to be the most holy, there has to be some kind of partition. Otherwise, it's just open air, and it's not really more holy than the other room. Okay, because again, the idea of the word holy is actually to be separate. That's the literal meaning of the word. It's to be separate or apart. And so it is not part of the same room as this. And so these 2 folding leaf partitions just move out of the way in order to enter into the most holy place. I don't believe these, again, one final time, I don't believe that these are the replacement for the veil. I don't believe that these are the in any way carrying or picking up the legacy of the torn, ripped veil. They're just functional doors as part of any building that you would find. Okay. And so here, again, here's another image of the temple structure. And we're going to move on now into chapter 42, and we're going to try to move on through it fairly quickly. It's a pretty short chapter. So chapter 42 says, "Then he brought me forth into the utter court, the way toward the north, and he brought me into the chamber that was over against the separate place, and which was before the building toward the north." And so when we look at our original pictures that we were seeing, you can see there's these chambers here. So the picture that I have pulled up now is a very similar image. It's just a little bit more 3D. And so we see they say, you can kind of ignore, it says dining room, and it'll say dining room a lot on these pictures. Just assume that word dining room isn't there, and just look at the actual building itself. Maybe some of these are used for dining, maybe some of them are used for sleeping quarters, maybe some of them are used as fellowship and gathering places. I don't know, but they say dining room, and I just don't want you to assume that everybody's eating everywhere all over the place. To them, they label everything dining room. You'll see that. I'm not going to mention that again. We'll move forward. So there's this chamber here, and it's toward the north, and that's where we're headed next. So he moved out of the temple, and he walked around out the north gate, and then back down this way, and that's what this arrow path is right here. That's kind of the path that Ezekiel is taking. He's being led in that general direction. And so, verse 2, "Before the length of 100 cubits was the north door, and the breadth was 50 cubits. Over against the 20 cubits which were for the inner court, and over against the pavement which was for the outer court, was gallery against gallery in 3 stories." And so here's the inner court, and then here's the outer court, and he's got gallery upon gallery in 3 stories. Here we go. So this is what we're talking about, the outer courtyard pavement, the inner courtyard, and then there's 20 cubits from the temple to this gallery, and these galleries are opposing, they're opposite one another. That's what exactly was described. And then between them, there's a way of 1 cubit. And it says, and before the chambers was a walk of 10 cubits breadth inward, a way of 1 cubit, and their doors toward the north. And this is, just to be very quick about it, this is one of the reasons why I take the 7-hand measure cubit as opposed to the 18-inch cubit. When you have a way of only 1 cubit wide, as much traffic as there's probably going to be through these areas, that extra 6-7 inches makes a big difference when 2 people are trying to walk past one another. And so 18 inches, you're going to be brushing up on somebody's shoulders or bumping into somebody's shoulders and giving them a shoulder check if you're not careful as you're trying to walk through this area. So again, if you use the standard 18-inch cubit, you end up with some awkward measurements that make things a little bit cramped, at least seemingly so. Maybe they won't be. But that's my understanding there, that it's another support for why I think what I think. Okay, and so verses 5 and 6, it says, now the upper chambers were shorter, for the galleries were higher than the lower, and then the middlemost of the building, for they were in 3 stories, but had not pillars, as the pillars of the courts. Therefore the building was straightened more than the lowest and the middlemost from the ground. And the wall that was without over against the chambers toward the utter court on the fore part of the chambers, the length thereof was 50 cubits. And that's the wall that it's describing right here. And it says, for the length of the chambers that were in the utter court was 50 cubits, and lo, before the temple were 100 cubits. So it's the same length as from one end of the temple to the other. You got the same 100 cubit length. Now, it says in verse 9, and from under these chambers was the entry on the east side, as one goeth into them from the utter court. And so that's the entry here. And then we see verse 10, thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed. That's the wrong verse 10. The chambers were in the thickness of the wall of the court toward the east, over against the separate place, and over against the building. And the way before them was like the appearance of the chambers which were toward the north, as long as they, and as broad as they, and all their goings out were both according to their fashions, and according to their doors. I didn't grab the separate pictures for the south side, because they're exactly the same as the north side, and they show up right down here. You don't need to see the red highlights to see that those are the same as the ones up here. There's the same stone wall down here as there is up here. These are 50 cubits. That's 50 cubits. This is 100 cubits right here. There's the way of 1 cubit here, the same as it is up here. So these verses are just describing the southern side, which is exactly the same as the northern. It says in verse 13, then said he unto me, the north chambers and the south chambers, which are before the separate place, they be holy chambers, where the priests that approach shall eat the most holy things. There shall they lay the most holy things, and the meat offering and the sin offering and the trespass offering, for the place is holy. So again, yes, some of this will be eating areas. I don't know that all 3 levels, every single room in every one of those levels, is all for eating. I'm just not sure of that. So that's why I hesitate just to say this whole structure is dining rooms. Moving on, verse 15 says, now when he had made an end of measuring the inner house, he brought me forth toward the gate, whose prospect is toward the east. And so you move out from the inner house, out through the gate that is toward the east, and measured it round about. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 reeds. 500 reeds. He measured the north side, 500 reeds, with the measuring reed round about. He measured the south side, 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He turned about to the west side, and he measured 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He measured it by the four sides, and it had a wall round about 500 reeds long and 500 broad to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place. So everything inside here, 500 reeds. Again, they're assuming a smaller measurement, so they're saying it's 5,100 feet. I would say it's a little bit larger than that. It might be a little bit over a mile by the time all is said and done, if you were to use my measurements. Either way, this is a very large area for a whole lot of different things, and we'll be reading about what is inside this area. But regardless, this wall is for a separation between the sanctuary, and everything outside is considered what is profane. Even with Jesus ruling on the earth, even with him present in this area directly for 1,000 years, everything outside of this area is considered profane. That doesn't mean that what you have outside is murder and debauchery and drunkenness and everything, but it's just not the holiness that exists in here. So, my understanding is that there probably will be, cities, parks, streets, all kinds of things are going to be in there. It's not just going to be barren, flat land. And we'll be reading about that. But again, the center of it all is the temple. The center of it all is this place here that is very special to God. And so God is in the center of everything. It's not, and that's not some grand, symbolic, thing that you have to really dig deep to understand. It's right there. It's pretty easy to understand. So, he will be in the center of everything. Everything will be focused around him in this place. The entire world, at times, will make journeys to this place. They'll enter in through these walls. They'll come and they'll enter in through these gates, and then they'll enter in through these inner gates, and then they'll be able to associate in the courtyard here. I don't believe there's going to be the same kind of separation between Jews and Gentiles in the millennial kingdom that there was originally. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to go into the most holy place. That's a special room with a special purpose. But everyone will have the ability to visit this place. No one will be turned away based on where they were born or who their parents are, who their grandparents were, because at this time, there's no need to keep Israel separate from the rest of the world in that same way. They have done their job as being the holy light to the world in the tribulation period, and they have converted people, and those converted people are the ones who persist into this kingdom with this structure. The people who would cause problems, the people who would later bring rebellion, they don't persist into the millennial kingdom. I believe they're born during the millennial kingdom. So we have this very specific city. This very specific structure with very specific proportions. Again, I'm not the person that's going to be the best person to go through and give you all of the individual spiritual significance of any specific one of these measurements. My personal opinion is that not all of them have all of these grand, great specific spiritual significances. Most things that are described in these past few chapters that we've been reading are measurements for a building. They're blueprints. And that's about it, in my opinion. They are designed as prophecy to, one, provide an idea of what is to come for the Jewish people, because this is their inheritance. This is part of what they will inherit, to provide an understanding of what is to come as an encouragement to them, and also as an encouragement to future Christians that will be partaking in the reign and in the administration of Jesus' kingdom, and this will be a location that we will probably frequent very often, as well as an encouragement to those, and I think specifically more than anything to those in the tribulation period. This will be an encouragement and something to look forward to. I think this is going to be more for them than it is for anybody in recorded history so far, because this is something that they're going to be able to read in Scripture, and they're going to say, well, this has never happened, and God says it's going to happen, so we know that this is something that's on its way. And they'll have that hope, they'll have that faith in that. So that is Ezekiel chapters 41 and 42. We've got a couple minutes. Does anybody have any comments or questions, or any of these pictures that you want me to go back to so you can get a better understanding of the proportions of everything?